So the Taliban won, and they've done so in a decidedly one-sided civil war once the United States began to withdraw. The collapse of the American-installed government ultimately has occurred so fast that we as in America, were not able to withdraw all our forces before the Taliban were able to take Kabul. And now, as we speak, thousands of American citizens who are part of the tail of the American forces, the tooth to tail ratio, are stuck there, stuck in their houses, stuck in this humanitarian crisis surrounding this airport, which is, the last speck of American occupation. Now we have our last standing embassy, the last McDonald's of Afghanistan. And there's the possibility that these people are going to be made into hostages. Although that's kind of doubtful, as the Taliban seem to be much more in favor of amnesty than revenge. And also, I personally believe these rumors, that rumor being that the American government has already covertly paid for the safe passage of its citizens at the end of its tail ratio with massive sums of money. The sad reality is that to most Americans, the war remains a mystery. Many of us are incredibly ignorant of the war and even 9/11 itself. I mean, I've talked to family members and they'll tell me that, Saddam Hussein did 9/11, and people believe Bush's debunked propaganda to this day. People don't even realize that the Afghanistan war has to do with 9/11. Most people just don't even know its connection between 9/11 and the Afghanistan war. And the day-to-day conduct of this war remains very difficult information for most Americans to find or digest, even including me. The war was very seldom discussed in the news and was simply forgotten about, while tens of thousands of American soldiers would become deployed there and thousands were wounded or even died. The void of information leaves many unanswered questions in its wake, and attempts to answer these questions have now been derisively called conspiracy theories by those who rule us. The mainstream narrative is that the terrorist group Al-Qaeda planned and carried out the 9/11 terrorist attacks, that this terrorist group took refuge under the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Then the United States invaded Afghanistan when the Taliban refused to hand over Al-Qaeda and its leadership. Then Al-Qaeda just simply escaped American forces. About 10 years later, the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, was then killed in a special forces raid in the country of Pakistan. And then the United States remained in Afghanistan 10 years after that, as Al-Qaeda dissolved into various splinter groups such as Daesh and al-Nusra. The Taliban even fought Daesh and defeated them, while America... So it's so sad, because Daesh and the Taliban had a civil war in Afghanistan, and the Taliban defeated Daesh, and instead of being defeated and executed or defeated and taken prisoner by the Taliban, the United States literally just took the Daesh soldiers away. They literally just airlifted them away from the Taliban. The Daesh surrendered, quote unquote, to the Taliban, and then or to the United States, and then were just airlifted out from the attacks of the Taliban. So that's pretty cool. So, I mean, bizarre. Because why would the Taliban refuse to hand over Osama bin Laden? Was Al-Qaeda not actually responsible then for 9/11? Was Al-Qaeda not even in Afghanistan? Were they actually in Pakistan the whole time? Who funded 9/11? What role did the Saudis play? Because after all, bin Laden was an estranged member of the royal family of Saudi Arabia. What role did the Pakistanis play in this? In the infamous ISI, the intelligence service of Pakistan, were they protecting Al-Qaeda this whole time? Was 9/11 actually an inside job which had been engineered for other means? And here we go. During the Vietnamese War, the CIA and the South Vietnamese government, along with the kingdoms of Laos and Cambodia, operated a massive opium trade, which was shut down when the communists came to power in 1975. And then in the 1980s, the CIA was heavily involved with the massive cocaine trade out of Latin America. And after the collapse of the communist government in Afghanistan in 1992, Afghanistan then became the dominant player in the global opium trade, which the Taliban shut down in 2000, right before that invasion in 2001. After the American invasion too, Afghanistan once again became the dominant opium grower of the world. And in this wake, a global heroin and opium crisis followed, and many Americans have been acutely affected by it. Was the real reason for this war and its real purpose to fund the CIA's global activities through a worldwide opium trade? Was 9/11 actually an inside job so the United States could establish a worldwide opium trade? If Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan, was he allowed to retreat there? Was Al-Qaeda there the whole time and wasn't actually in Afghanistan? Did the Pakistani government know this? The Inner Services of Intelligence, or the ISA, or ISI of Pakistan, its intelligence service, which is comparable to the CIA, is believed to act largely independent of the Pakistani government. They're the ones that support the terrorists in the Kashmir province and attempt to start wars over and over again with India without the direct knowledge of the civilian government of Pakistan. Pakistan supported the Taliban in the 1990s. Many of the fighters in the Taliban were actually born in Pakistan. This war spread into the northwest province of Pakistan, and the American Air Force were conducting airstrikes in Pakistan for years, often with the complete indifference to Pakistan's wishes for the American Air Force and its drones to be operating there. Was the war in Afghanistan really a proxy war between the nuclear armed powers of the United States and Pakistan? Or was it even worse, a proxy war between the rogue intelligence agencies of these two nuclear armed powers? I doubt any of these questions are going to be answered, because Biden's going to blame Trump for the failure, as he did last night, of the American forces in the country, and the media is going to memory hold this pretty soon, at least once all the hostages are paid for and able to leave the country. And I doubt that they're even going to talk about this war during the 2022 congressional elections. But overall, I would say, in my opinion on these conspiracy theories, is that the greatest debunker of conspiracy theories is the demonstrated incompetence of the American government and other governments in their day-to-day conduct. And the American government at every level of its functioning is clearly brutally incompetent. One can see truly how incompetent it is here, especially when you compare it to the Vietnamese War. In the Vietnam War, which was in the long term of history, again, very poorly conducted, the Americans attempted to fight a war of attrition against the guerrilla troops of the Viet Cong, which were armed by the North Vietnamese, which the Americans refused to invade. And instead of taking territory against these Viet Cong guerrillas, which were armed by the North, the United States literally just focused upon some misguided attempt at attrition warfare by using excessive dropping of ordnance, artillery, air bombing upon areas which they believed these hostile guerrillas to be hiding. And victory wasn't measured wasn't measured by territory taken or even enemies really killed, but enemies estimated to be killed by the munitions dropped. And, the South Vietnamese military was highly politicized and had very low morale. And as the war went on, American forces got lower and lower morale as racial conflict overtook the lower elements of the Army and Marines, and low-level mutinies were becoming common, with the infamous fragging where lower-level officers were killed by their troops under their command. Yet as the United States withdrew from this war, the North Vietnamese are organizing the massive Easter Offensive of 1972. The North Vietnamese were actually beaten back by the South Vietnamese units, who were aided by American advisors, and the Air Force and Navy, who provided fire support. The Americans, because of their victory in the Easter Offensive of 1972, were easily able to evacuate both their teeth and tails at the beginning of 1973, and were able to do pretty peaceful prisoner exchanges. And by January 27th, 1973, the United States were able to leave the Vietnamese War peacefully and without a humanitarian crisis of the leftover elements of the tail for the most part of the United States. The South Vietnamese were then able to fight on until 1975, when another large invasion overwhelmed the country. And by that time, the South Vietnamese were actually under a heavy international arms embargo and had grievous supply shortages. Armored units were abandoned. The Vietnamese had to resort to using M1 Garands with very limited ammo, because the United States refused to give them any oil or ammo anymore, as the Democrats refused during the Watergate crisis to continue to send aid to South Vietnam, while China and the Soviet Union continued to heavily aid the North. So, arguably, South Vietnam might have lasted more than 2 or 3 years without America's support, had America not directly intervened, but simply didn't have an arms embargo on them. And as South Vietnam was overwhelmed by the North, tens of thousands of northern Vietnamese soldiers were killed by the South Vietnamese, who fought very hard in the fall of Saigon. Now, let's compare the Taliban and how they took over Afghanistan this summer, because this mirrors directly the offensive in 1972. And the Taliban basically won without firing very many shots. Large elements of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan simply defected to the Taliban while the Americans were still withdrawing. And instead of in the Easter Offensive of 1972, the United States sent in the Air Force, sent in the Navy to provide very heavy fire support along with American intelligence to rout the North Vietnamese and provide the room for the Americans to leave. During this, the Americans just withdrew as the Taliban won overwhelming victory after overwhelming victory. Or I shouldn't even say that, is the Islamic Republic simply defected to the Taliban. And that meant that our huge elements of the tail of the American forces were left behind as the teeth left first. And the American forces weren't able to finish withdrawing, as the Taliban literally just walked into the presidential palace and declared their emirate. And now there's this huge humanitarian crisis which is happening in the Kabul airport that the Americans just simply weren't able to anticipate that their collaborators would join the Taliban and fight against them. So, but from the beginning of this war, it was conducted very incompetently. Right at the very beginning, right? It's interesting now because the Taliban control more of the country in 2021 than they did at the beginning of the onset of the war in 2001. There were the Northern Alliance militias who held, I believe, 10 or 15% of the northern parts of Afghanistan and were continuing to fight a civil war against the Taliban. So what the United States did is it just dropped a few special forces, and then it used its Air Force to attack the Taliban between the special forces and the militias of the Northern Alliance. The Taliban directly saw this, and there's a handful of times where they fought back. Kunduz is the most infamous one, right? But the Taliban simply saw that America was invading, and because America only had a few hundred soldiers or a few thousand soldiers in the country, they weren't able to prevent the Taliban from simply moving out of the cities and setting up highly defensible positions in the mountains, and outright retreating into Pakistan itself, as Pakistan's blatantly supported the Taliban. So Instead of the United States routing and destroying all the Taliban fighters, the United States committed a very small force into Afghanistan itself, unlike the Soviets, and allowed the Taliban en masse to escape. So this is most infamous in the airlift out of Kunduz, which was the city that got encircled in the northern part of Afghanistan by special forces and the Northern Alliance. And this is where this is a conspiracy theory that the United States will not admit to. The ISI of Pakistan literally just took the Taliban leadership and, if they were really in the country, the Al-Qaeda leadership, and just airlifted them directly into Afghanistan. And I believe that the Taliban publicly revealed now that their leadership was just in the UAE the whole time. The leadership was just blatantly in the UAE or in Pakistan conducting the war. So now over the last 20 years as this war has continued, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan is simply the mayoral government of Kabul. And, everybody in Afghanistan called the president of that republic just the mayor of Kabul. The American leadership were completely indifferent to the outcome of the war as it shuffled through commanding generals. In fact, there were more commanding generals over the course of the war, often in competing, horizontal positions than there were years of the war. At the beginning of Obama's term, the small occupation forces, which were most special forces, were expanded, and Obama did a surge into the country. And the American forces would often go out into villages, and the Taliban leadership would hide, and the local administration was actually working for the Taliban, and they acknowledged the Kabul government, in the radio or in emails. But in reality, the Taliban was in charge of almost all of the outside areas of Afghanistan, outside of Kabul. And when the Americans would go in the area, they would say, hey, we're with Kabul, and they wouldn't fight. The Taliban wouldn't fight them. The Americans would leave, and then the Taliban would simply go up and take back control of the country. So, all these people, all these, administrations or administrative capitals or basically county seats of Afghanistan were really ruled by the Taliban this whole time. So when the United States withdrew and they literally just defected to the Taliban, we actually knew that for the past 20 years. I was surprised, actually, that Kabul didn't resist, because I thought that there would be, something like a Republican Guard that would be loyal. And as I said before, I thought maybe the United States Air Force would intervene to protect this Republican Guard, which would remain loyal, and there might be, a battle for Kabul for a month or so. So I said on Twitter, is this going to end by, Halloween? No, it ended in a few days. Even the government of Kabul defected to the Taliban. And, after all this chaos, we can now see how advantageous it really is for America's foreign policy and its domestic policy to have a president with dementia. How his poor decision-making and indecision can transform a failure into a catastrophe, right? They didn't even finish withdrawing people. They didn't try to protect the capital to prevent this humanitarian crisis or alleviate it. He just sat in Camp David while the whole thing happened, didn't address anybody. And, he blamed it on Trump, said all these bizarre things, and then told everybody how great it was that all these refugees will be coming into the country. And now he's back in Camp David. And now we can look at the military. It's thoroughly politicized and completely inept and useless. It's as inept and useless as, any Arab military, really. It's just bolstered by how advanced his technology is. It's very, very commissarist. And, look at somebody like Milley, General Milley, who's the leader of the chiefs of staff. And he was appointed by Obama in 2015. Trump didn't think to actually force him out. And he goes up before Congress and talks about how wonderful cultural Marxism is. And, it really makes you think. You could point to Afghanistan as the Soviets left in February of 89, and then the Soviet Union itself dissolved in December of 91, and you could be like, oh, look at that. I don't want to make any direct comparisons, but throughout the course of history, when your imperial outposts fall into these devastating defeats, usually it results in an imminent domestic collapse, because the empire isn't really held up through, domestic support. If you look up on right-wing Twitter, it's very apparent that most of right-wing Twitter was actually rooting for the Taliban. And the Taliban aren't their real allies. The Taliban still enforce this right-wing, or I shouldn't say right-wing version, but this, extremist, more extreme than Mohammed version of Islam. And they're very corrupt. They're not your natural ally. But nobody at home really, supports the current government here. Nobody supports America anymore. And that kind of, hollowness, this lack of patriotism that a nation might have. A nation might be patriotic, but an empire isn't patriotic. And that's why when these defeats happen and people without and within an empire see how weak that empire has become, it precludes an imminent domestic collapse, because people within the empire no longer support the empire, because without and within the empire is supported not through nationalism, but through force and through, bread and circuses. So there are some pretty dark days ahead for the American people, as it becomes clearer and clearer that the American government, the American economy, and the American system are so weak. Massive amounts of illegal immigrants are crossing without any resistance. And the United States is just going to import, tens of thousands of Afghani refugees. OPEC has said that they're not going to keep pumping oil, with Biden's closing down of American oil wells. So that now we're going to have a 1973 style oil crisis, where the government's unable to predict how severe its inflation is going. And, it seems the vaccines are failing with breakthrough cases, and there's going to be more lockdowns. The American government and the American system is in complete retreat, and very few people are loyal to it. So very, very dark days ahead.